I never expected that a meticulously planned, offensively expensive, and utterly unwanted vacation would be the thing to dismantle my life. My life was a fortress built of routine and quiet order, a minimalist apartment in a city that thrived on noise, a job as a graphic designer that allowed me to communicate through color and line rather than clumsy words. I liked my walls. They were smooth, high, and familiar. This resort, with its relentlessly cheerful staff and its cacophony of laughter and splashing water, was an assault on my senses. A week of forced relaxation, a gift from my sister who insisted I was becoming a hermit. She wasn't wrong, but I had curated my hermitage with the precision of a museum curator. Everything was in its proper place. He was not in his proper place. Or rather, he was, and I was the one who was out of alignment. His name was Liam, a fact I learned from the bartender on the second day when I'd been nursing the same club soda for an hour, using the condensation on the glass as a shield for my covert observations. He was a monument of a man, carved from warmer, kinder stone than the city architecture I was used to. Broad shoulders that seemed designed to carry more than just the weight of a beach towel, arms corded with muscle that spoke of real work, not the curated definition of a gym. His hair was the color of dark honey, bleached in random streaks by the sun, and it was perpetually messy, as if he'd just run his hands through it. He was always surrounded. A constellation of bright, loud people orbited him. Friends, cousins, I couldn't tell. They were a tribe, and he was their quiet center. He'd laugh with them, a low, rumbling sound that traveled across the water and vibrated in my chest, but he never seemed to demand the spotlight. He just held it, effortlessly. There was a woman, pretty and blonde, who often had her hand on his arm, in my mind. A relentless architect of impossible scenarios immediately cast her as his girlfriend, his fiancée, his wife. She was the final, insurmountable brick in the wall separating his world from mine. So I watched, from the sterile safety of my lounge chair, from the shadowy corner of the open-air restaurant, from the cool anonymity of the pool bar. I became a scholar of Liam. I learned the way he'd squint against the sun, the small smile that would touch his lips before a full laugh broke free. I cataloged the scent of his sunscreen, a coconut and salt air fragrance that drifted on the humid breeze. He was a piece of art in a gallery I was not allowed to touch, a vibrant, living sculpture I could only admire from behind a velvet rope. My loneliness, usually a quiet and manageable companion, sharpened into a dull, persistent ache in his presence. It was a yearning for a world I felt I could never inhabit, a world of easy laughter and casual, confident touch. A world where a man like him existed, and I was just me, the quiet observer in the corner, building beautiful things on a screen while life happened, loud and sun-drenched, just out of reach. My routine here was a pale imitation of my one at home. Wake up, coffee, work on my laptop for a few hours until the guilt of being indoors in paradise became too much, then migrate to the pool with a book I would never read. I would find my spot, always the same one, partially shaded by a palm tree, and I would pretend to be absorbed in the pages while my entire awareness was tethered to him. It was a pathetic, secret ritual, and it was the only thing that gave my days a focal point. I told myself it was harmless, a simple aesthetic appreciation. But the feeling in my gut, a hollow, twisting thing, knew it was something far deeper and far more dangerous to the careful peace I had constructed for myself. The sky had been a deceptive, brilliant blue all day. There was no warning, just a sudden shift in the air. The humidity, already a heavy blanket, thickened until it felt like breathing water. The cheerful chatter around the pool faltered, heads turning towards the horizon where a bruised black wall of clouds was advancing with unnatural speed. The wind picked up, rattling the palm fronds with a sound like dry bones. It started with a few fat, heavy drops of rain, splattering onto the hot stone around the pool, each one leaving a dark, spreading stain. Then the sky opened. It wasn't rain, it was a deluge, a solid sheet of water that blurred the world into a gray watercolor painting. People scrambled, grabbing towels and bags, their shrieks of surprise quickly swallowed by the rising roar of the storm. I was already gathering my things, my natural anxiety kicking into high gear. This was a disruption of the highest order, a chaotic intrusion into the carefully managed rhythm of the day. As I shoved my laptop into its waterproof sleeve, a flicker of movement caught my eye. It was Liam, not running for cover, but helping a young mother wrangle a stroller and two panicked children under the relative safety of the bar's thatched roof. He moved with a calm, unhurried efficiency that seemed to defy the escalating panic around him. For a moment, he looked up, his eyes scanning the chaos, and for a fraction of a second, they met mine. There was no recognition, just a fleeting, impersonal contact, but it was enough to make my heart hammer against my ribs, a frantic counter-rhythm to the drumming of the rain. The lights flickered once, twice, and then died, plunging the resort into a dim, stormy twilight. A collective groan went through the small crowd huddled under the bar's awning. The cheerful resort music was replaced by the raw, elemental sound of the storm. The wind howled, and the rain was now coming down in horizontal sheets, lashing at our flimsy shelter. My carefully ordered world had officially been upended by a force of nature. And somewhere in the churning mess of my anxiety, a tiny, treacherous spark of excitement ignited. The rules had just been washed away. A resort employee with a powerful flashlight and a strained smile appeared, shouting over the wind. The main generator was down. Some of the lower-lying bungalows were already taking on water. For safety, they were moving everyone to the larger, more secure cabins on the hill. My bungalow, number 12, was on the list of those to be evacuated. I felt a surge of pure panic. The comfortable, solitary space I had retreated to now declared unsafe. We were herded like damp, confused sheep through the gale, following the bouncing beam of the flashlight. The world was a maelstrom of wind, water, and shouting. We were led to a large wooden cabin, set back from the others and nestled against a thick stand of trees that seemed to be absorbing the worst of the wind. It was clearly one of the premium accommodations, with a wide porch and large windows. Inside, the air was still and dry. Staff members were handing out towels and bottled water. People were milling about, a strange mix of giddy excitement and genuine fear on their faces. I found a corner, wrapped a towel around my shoulders, and tried to make myself as small as possible, wishing I could just disappear. "Alex." The voice was low, calm, and directly behind me. I froze. I had never spoken a single word to him, yet he knew my name. I turned slowly, my heart doing a painful, lurching thing in my chest. It was Liam. He stood there, his hair plastered to his forehead, his t-shirt soaked and clinging to the solid lines of his chest. He wasn't smiling, just looking at me with an expression of mild concern. "You're in bungalow 12, right?" "I'm in 13. They said our section is a mess." I could only manage a nod, my throat suddenly tight. How did he know my bungalow number? Had he noticed me as much as I had noticed him? The thought was both thrilling and terrifying. Before I could formulate a coherent sentence, a stressed-looking manager with a clipboard approached us. "Liam and Alex?" "Right. Okay, we've got a problem. The system is down, and we're over capacity in the main hall. Your bungalows are side by side, so the system booked you both into this cabin. It's our last available space. It's a 2-bedroom, but we only have one set of keys prepared." He held up a single, solitary key card. "You'll have to share. Just for tonight, hopefully. We're very sorry for the inconvenience." The world seemed to slow down. The noise of the storm, the chatter of the other guests, it all faded into a dull roar. There was only the space between me and Liam, suddenly charged with an impossible, terrifying potential. He was supposed to be a distant observation, a museum piece. He was not supposed to be my roommate. He looked from the manager to me, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. I expected him to object, to demand a different arrangement, to pull the kind of confident move a guy like him would surely make. Instead, he just gave a small, weary sigh and held out his hand to the manager. "It's fine. We'll manage." He took the key, his fingers closing around it. Then he looked at me, a faint, almost apologetic smile on his lips. "Neighbors, huh? Guess we're roommates now." The walls of my fortress, already battered by the storm, had just been breached. And the man I had spent days admiring from a safe distance was now standing on the inside, holding the key. The cabin was beautiful, and under any other circumstances, I would have appreciated it. Dark wood floors, a high-ceilinged living area with a stone fireplace, and a wall of windows that looked out into the thrashing, rain-lashed darkness. It smelled of cedar and clean linens. but I was too aware of him, of his presence filling the space, to notice much else. The air was thick with a silence that felt louder than the storm raging outside. We moved around each other with the awkward, exaggerated care of two people trying not to touch a live wire. "I'll take the couch if you want the bed," he said, breaking the silence. His voice, without the background noise of the pool, was even lower, a soft rumble that seemed to vibrate through the wooden floorboards. "No," I said, my own voice sounding thin and unfamiliar. "There are 2 bedrooms," the manager said. "We can just take one each." It was the logical, sensible thing to say. The thing that would maintain the distance, re-establish the boundaries. Liam ran a hand through his wet hair, looking around the living room. "Right? Yeah. Of course," he gestured towards a hallway. "You pick." I felt like I was being tested. I pointed to the first door. "This one's fine." I needed to be alone, to recalibrate, to process the fact that Liam was breathing the same contained air as me. I slipped inside the room and closed the door, leaning against it for a moment. The room was simple, a large bed, a nightstand, a window. Through the wall, I could hear the faint sounds of him moving around in the other room, the soft thud of a bag being dropped, the squeak of a floorboard. He was real. He was here. My fortress was gone, and I was adrift in a small wooden cabin with a walking, talking embodiment of all my secret, hopeless yearnings. The scent of him began to permeate the space. It was subtle at first, just the clean, soapy smell from his skin, mixed with the dampness of his clothes and the faint, lingering traces of salt and sunscreen. But as the hours wore on, it became the primary scent in the cabin, eclipsing the cedar and the rain. It was a constant, low-level reminder of his proximity, a sensory invasion that kept my nerves perpetually on edge. Every creak of the house was him. The sound of a faucet running, the quiet hum of his breathing from the other room. I was attuned to his every move. After a while, a quiet knock came at my door. "Hey," his voice was muffled. "Found a bottle of whiskey in the minibar. And some flashlights. Figured we might need both." I opened the door. He was standing there holding an almost full bottle of expensive-looking whiskey and 2 heavy-duty flashlights. He had changed into a dry t-shirt and a pair of gray sweatpants that hung low on his hips. The sight was so casually domestic it made my stomach clench. "Okay," I managed to say. We sat in the living room, on opposite ends of a large sofa, the space between us a yawning chasm. The only light came from the beams of the flashlights we'd placed on the coffee table, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. The storm was a constant, percussive backdrop to our silence. He poured 2 fingers of whiskey into 2 glasses, the sound of the liquid splashing against the glass unnaturally loud. He slid one over to me. Our fingers brushed as I took it. A jolt, sharp and electric, shot up my arm. It was nothing, a meaningless, accidental contact, but my body reacted as if I'd been struck by lightning. I pulled my hand back quickly, hoping he hadn't noticed. He had. He looked at my hand, then back up at my face, his expression unreadable in the flickering light. "Sorry," he murmured, taking a sip of his own drink. "It's fine," I said, my voice tight. I took a large swallow of whiskey, the burn a welcome distraction. We sat like that for a long time, drinking in silence, listening to the rain. The awkwardness should have been unbearable, but it wasn't. It was a different kind of tension, a heavy, charged stillness. It felt less like 2 strangers forced together and more like 2 people on the verge of something they didn't have the words for yet. "I've seen you," he said finally, his voice soft. He was staring into his glass, swirling the amber liquid. "At the pool. You're always reading." My blood went cold. "Oh, yeah. I was a terrible liar. I hadn't read a single page all week." He looked up, and his eyes found mine in the dim light. "I'm not much of a reader. My sister, she's the smart one. She's the one who organized this whole trip." He gestured vaguely towards the dark windows. "Family thing. It gets a lot." "The blonde woman?" I asked, the question slipping out before I could stop it. My face burned with shame. A small, tired smile touched his lips. "That's Sarah, my brother's wife. She's the ringleader. Thinks if she throws enough parties at me, I'll magically become the life of 1 inch." He took another drink of whiskey. "I'm better in small groups. Or alone." The confession hung in the air between us. It was a crack in the facade, a glimpse behind the curtain of the confident, social man I had constructed in my mind. He wasn't the sun at the center of that solar system. He was a quiet planet, pulled into its orbit against his will. He was like me. The thought was so staggering, so world-altering, that I almost couldn't breathe. Me too, I whispered. The admission felt momentous, a bridge of a single sentence built across the chasm on the sofa. He met my gaze, and this time, he held it. The silence that followed was different. It wasn't empty anymore. It was filled with a dawning, terrifying understanding. The physical distance between us on the couch felt absurd when the emotional distance had just vanished in a puff of smoke. The storm outside seemed to redouble its efforts, the wind shrieking around the corners of the cabin, but inside, a profound quiet had fallen. It was the quiet of two people who had just realized they were not alone. The whiskey was gone, and the bottle sat empty on the table between us like a surrendered flag. The storm had settled into a steady, rhythmic drumming on the roof, a constant, lulling sound. The flashlight beams were starting to dim, their circles of light growing weak and yellow. We hadn't spoken much more, but we hadn't needed to. We had just sat there, in the dark, sharing the silence. It was the most comfortable I had felt all week. We should probably get some sleep, I said, the words feeling clumsy and loud in the quiet room. Liam nodded slowly, his movements lethargic. Yeah, probably, but he didn't move. He just kept looking at me, his gaze heavy and intense. The shadows cast by the dying flashlights carved hollows under his cheekbones, making his face look older, more serious. The air grew thick again, charged with all the things we weren't saying. The space on the couch between us seemed to shrink, the magnetic pull of his presence becoming almost irresistible. "Are you okay over there?" he asked, his voice a low murmur. It was a simple question, but it felt loaded, pivotal. He wasn't asking about my comfort or my fear of the storm. He was asking something else entirely. I couldn't find my voice to answer, so I just nodded. My heart was a frantic bird beating against the cage of my ribs. This was it. This was the precipice. I could feel the world tilting on its axis. He moved then, not fast, but with a slow, deliberate motion that seemed to take an eternity. He shifted on the couch, closing the distance between us until his knee was brushing against mine. The contact was a brand, a point of searing heat that radiated through my entire body. I didn't pull away. I couldn't. I was paralyzed, caught in the gravity of him. He watched my face, his eyes searching mine in the gloom, looking for a signal, for permission. Then, he lifted his hand. I watched it move through the shadowy air, a slow-motion trajectory towards an unavoidable impact. His fingers were long, his knuckles calloused. It was a capable, strong hand. It came to rest on my thigh, just above my knee. The pressure was gentle at first, a light, questioning weight. But it was unambiguous. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't a friendly gesture. It was a claim. My breath hitched. The entire universe seemed to shrink to that single point of contact. The warmth of his palms seeped through the thin fabric of my pants, sinking into my skin, into my muscle, into my bone. It was an anchor in the swirling chaos of my mind. My carefully constructed walls, the fortress I had spent years building and reinforcing, didn't just crumble. They evaporated. They turned to dust and blew away on the wind of the storm, leaving me utterly exposed, vulnerable, and more seen than I had ever been in my entire life. His thumb moved, a slow, deliberate stroke against the fabric. It was a question, a final confirmation. I leaned into the touch, a tiny, almost imperceptible movement, but it was enough. It was my answer. His gaze dropped from my eyes to my lips. He leaned in, and the scent of him, whiskey, soap, and that unique, indefinable Liam scent, filled my head, intoxicating and overwhelming. The first touch of his lips was impossibly soft. It was tentative, questioning, a whisper of contact that asked more than it took. I let out a breath I didn't realize I had been holding, and my eyes fluttered shut. This was real. This was happening. I met the gentle pressure of his mouth with my own, a silent surrender. The kiss deepened, slowly, as if we were learning a new language together. It wasn't a kiss of frantic passion, but of dawning recognition, of profound, soul-deep relief. It tasted of whiskey and rain and the end of a long, lonely wait. His other hand came up to cup my jaw, his thumb stroking my cheek, and I felt a tremor run through him. Or maybe it was me. In that moment, we were just two solitary people, finding shelter not just from the storm outside, but from the quiet storms within ourselves. The world I had known, with its predictable lines and safe distances, was gone forever, and I didn't want it back. The morning arrived quiet and bruised. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean and unervingly still. Sunlight, thin and pale, filtered through the windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. The magical, intimate bubble of the night had burst with the dawn, and in its place, a thick, suffocating awkwardness had settled. We hadn't made it to the separate bedrooms. We had fallen asleep on the couch, tangled together under a blanket we'd found in a closet, my head on his chest, the steady rhythm of his heartbeat a lullaby against my ear. I woke up first, disoriented. For a blissful second, I was just warm and comfortable. Then memory flooded back in a hot, panicked rush. The whiskey, the confession, the touch, the kiss. I was lying on Liam. My hand was splayed across his stomach. His arm was draped protectively over my shoulders. I extracted myself from his hold with the slow, painstaking care of a bomb disposal expert, my every movement screamingly loud in the silence. I slid off the couch and stood there, my heart hammering, looking down at him. He looked younger in his sleep, his face relaxed, his mouth slightly parted. He was beautiful, and he was a stranger I had kissed, a stranger whose body had been my shelter for the night. My anxiety, a feral creature that had been sedated by whiskey and intimacy, woke up and began to tear me apart from the inside. What had I done? What had we done? The logic of the daylight was harsh and unforgiving. Last night was a fluke, an anomaly created by a storm, darkness, and alcohol. A moment of shared loneliness that meant nothing. He was going to wake up full of regret, disgusted with himself, with me. I had crossed a line. I had taken his moment of vulnerability and twisted it, misread it. I had ruined the fragile, nascent connection between us. I had ruined everything. I escaped to the bathroom, splashing cold water on my face, but it didn't help. The person looking back at me from the mirror was a stranger, his eyes wide with panic. I was the quiet observer, the man in the corner. I didn't do things like this. I didn't kiss magnificent, unattainable men in storm-swept cabins. My life had rules for a reason. The rules kept me safe. Now there were no rules, and I was terrified. When I came back out, he was awake. He was sitting on the edge of the couch, his elbows on his knees, staring at the floor. He didn't look at me. The easy intimacy of the night was gone, replaced by a chasm wider and deeper than the one that had been there before. He was a million miles away. The air crackled with unspoken words, with regret, with my own spiraling fear. "Morning," he said, his voice rough with sleep. He still didn't look up. "Morning," I squeaked, my throat dry. I busied myself with a meaningless task, folding the blanket we had shared, my movements jerky and awkward. I needed to fix this, to put things back the way they were. I had to give him an out. "About last night," I began, my voice trembling slightly. "The storm, the whiskey. I'm sorry if I—" He finally looked up, and his eyes were guarded, distant. "Don't," he said, his voice flat. He stood up, stretching his arms over his head, the movement pulling his t-shirt taut across his chest. He was deliberately creating distance, putting his body back into a state of untouchable perfection. "The power's back on. I should probably go check on my bungalow. Get my stuff." Each word was a hammer blow to my chest. He was running. He was escaping. My worst fears were confirmed. It was a mistake. He regretted it. He wanted to pretend it never happened. The emotional whiplash was staggering, from the profound connection of the kiss to this cold, sterile distance. It hurt more than the loneliness ever had. The loneliness had been a dull ache. This was a sharp, clean wound. "Yeah," I said, my voice hollow. "Okay." I watched as he gathered the few things he'd brought with him, his phone, his wallet. He moved with a brisk efficiency, avoiding my gaze, avoiding the coffee table where the empty whiskey bottle still stood, a silent monument to our temporary insanity. The emotional chasm between us was no longer a quiet gap. It was a roaring, empty canyon. He was back on his side of the world, and I was back on mine. The velvet rope was back in place, thicker and higher than ever before. He had become a museum piece once more, except now I knew exactly what it felt like to touch the art. And the memory was excruciating. He walked to the door, his hand on the knob. This was it. He would walk out, and we would go back to being strangers, except it would be worse, because now we would be strangers with a secret, a shared moment of madness that we would both have to pretend never existed. The thought was unbearable. My carefully ordered world had been shattered, and I was left standing alone in the rubble. He paused at the door, his back to me. His shoulders were tense. For a long moment, he didn't move, his knuckles white where he gripped the doorknob. The silence stretched, thin and taut, ready to snap. I held my breath, bracing myself for the final, mercifully quick departure. Then, he let out a long, slow breath and turned around. He wasn't looking at the door anymore. He was looking directly at me. His expression was no longer distant or guarded. It was raw, vulnerable, and filled with a desperate, churning conflict that mirrored my own. "Can we talk for a second?" he asked, his voice low and strained. The words hung in the air, a terrifying, hopeful lifeline. I braced myself for the speech, the gentle letdown, the "I'm not gay," or the "that was a mistake," or the "let's just be friends." I prepared my face to be neutral, to be understanding, to make it easy for him. I would absorb the blow, retreat back into my fortress, and spend years rebuilding the walls, higher and stronger this time. "Okay," I whispered, my voice barely audible. He let go of the doorknob and took a step back into the room, running a hand through his already messy hair in a gesture of pure frustration. "This," he said, gesturing vaguely at the space between us, at the couch, at the whole room. "Me. This morning. I'm not good at this." He finally met my eyes, and what I saw there wasn't regret. It was fear. He was just as terrified as I was. "I didn't run away this morning because I regretted it," he said, his voice gaining a sliver of strength. "I ran away because I was terrified that you did. I woke up, and you were gone, and I thought I'd completely misread everything, that I'd pushed you into something you didn't want." The floor seemed to drop out from under me. All my carefully constructed theories, my anxious, self-deprecating narratives, they all shattered at my feet. We had been trapped in the exact same prison of doubt, sitting in cells right next to each other, both convinced we were alone. "Liam," I started, but he held up a hand, needing to finish. "I've been watching you, too," he confessed, the words rushing out now. "Since the first day, you, with your book and your quiet corner. You looked peaceful. You looked like everything my life isn't. All that noise," he gestured towards the door, towards the rest of the resort. "It's not me. It's my family. They mean well, but I feel like I'm drowning in it sometimes. And I'd look over, and you'd be there, and it was like you were an island. And I just wanted to swim to you." My breath caught in my throat. An island. He saw me as an island. I, who had felt like a ghost haunting the edges of his world, had been a landmark in his. "Sarah, my sister-in-law," he continued. "She keeps trying to set me up. She doesn't get it. She thinks I'm just shy." He gave a short, humorless laugh. "I'm not shy. I'm just not interested. Not in the people she introduces me to." He took another step closer, his eyes pleading with me to understand. "Last night wasn't the whiskey. It wasn't the storm. It was me, finally running out of excuses not to do the one thing I've wanted to do since I first saw you sitting at the pool bar." The dam inside me broke. The relief was so sudden, so overwhelming. It felt like a physical force, knocking the air from my lungs. "I thought you were straight," I blurted out. "You and Sarah? I thought." "God, no," he said, a real smile finally breaking through, transforming his face. "She's like a sister to me, a very loud, meddling sister." He was standing in front of me now, so close I could feel the warmth radiating from his body. "I thought you were going to regret it. I thought I was just some drunken mistake you made." "No," I said, my voice thick with emotion. It was everything. It was the truest thing I had ever said." He searched my face for a moment longer, and then the last of the tension seemed to drain out of him. The fear in his eyes was replaced by a soft, incredulous wonder. "Yeah," he breathed. "Me too." And then he was closing the final inches between us, and his mouth was on mine again. This kiss was nothing like the first one. There was no hesitation, no question. It was sure, deep, and desperate with relief. It was a confirmation, a celebration. His hands came up to frame my face, his thumbs tracing the line of my jaw, and I wrapped my arms around his waist, pulling him tight against me, needing to feel the solid, real warmth of him. It felt like coming home to a place I had never been before. The awkward morning, the anxious spiral, the perceived distance, it all dissolved in the profound, simple truth of our shared confession. We had found our way back to the shelter of the storm, but this time, in the clear light of day. The rest of the vacation unfolded like a dream I was afraid to wake from. Liam did go back to his bungalow, but only to retrieve his things before moving them, officially and without apology, into mine. We existed in a secret bubble within the larger, oblivious world of the resort. To everyone else, we were just the two guys from the evacuated bungalows who had become friends. But in the quiet moments, our new reality took root and began to grow. We spent our days by the quieter, more secluded pool at the far end of the resort, away from the boisterous energy of his family. We laid on lounge chairs side by side, our hands intertwined between them, a small, secret point of contact. We talked for hours, filling in the blank spaces of each other's lives. I learned that he was an architect, that he loved the clean, logical lines of buildings, but found his peace in the chaos of his woodworking hobby. He learned about my sterile city apartment, my love for typography, and my paralyzing fear of small talk. We were uncovering the mundane, beautiful details of each other, building a foundation brick by brick. The nights were ours. We'd have dinner on our cabin's porch, listening to the chirping of the insects in the humid darkness, the resort's party music a distant, muffled pulse. He taught me the names of the constellations visible in the clear, post-storm sky. I would watch the starlight reflect in his eyes and feel a sense of peace that was so deep and profound it was almost frightening. Later, we would lie in bed, not always touching, but always aware of each other, the space between us no longer a chasm, but a comfortable, shared territory. Sometimes he would reach out in his sleep and his hand would find mine, his fingers lacing through mine with an unconscious familiarity that made my heart ache with a sweet, unfamiliar joy. One afternoon, we were at the main pool bar, the scene of my initial, lonely surveillance. It felt strange to be there with him, sitting on a stool right next to me, his knee pressed warmly against mine under the bar. He ordered us drinks, his voice that same low rumble that had once seemed so distant, now a familiar and comforting sound meant just for me. His family was at the other end of the pool, and Sarah waved. Liam waved back, a relaxed, easy smile on his face, before turning his attention fully back to me. He was no longer a planet trapped in their orbit. He was his own sun, and he was choosing to shine on me. A bank of dark clouds, a harmless echo of the great storm, began to gather on the horizon. The sky darkened for a few moments, and the air grew heavy. Liam leaned in close, his breath warm against my ear. "Looks like we might need to share a cabin again," he whispered, a conspiratorial grin spreading across his face. I laughed, a real, uninhibited sound. It was our first inside joke, a callback to the night that had changed everything. It was a small, perfect thing, a secret thread that bound us together. In that moment, surrounded by people and noise, we were completely alone in our shared world, a world born of chaos and cemented in quiet understanding. On our last night, we walked along the beach. The sand was cool under our bare feet, and the waves whispered against the shore. We walked in comfortable silence, his hand holding mine, a simple, public act of possession that still sent a thrill through me. I had spent so much of my life observing from the sidelines, building walls to protect myself from the pain of wanting what I couldn't have. I had curated my loneliness, mistaken my fortress for a home. The storm had been a cataclysm, a violent disruption that had torn down every defense I had. It had forced me into the path of the one thing I wanted and feared in equal measure. It had thrown me into chaos, and in that chaos, I had found not destruction, but connection. I had found Liam. Or maybe, we had found each other. He stopped walking and turned to face me, the moonlight silvering the edges of his silhouette. He didn't say anything. He just looked at me, his eyes full of a soft, steady affection that felt more real and more solid than anything I had ever known. He reached out and gently brushed a stray piece of hair from my forehead. It was a small gesture, insignificant to anyone else, but to me, it was everything. It was care. It was intimacy. It was a promise. I realized then that vulnerability wasn't a weakness to be defended against. It was simply an opening. It was the unlocked door that allowed someone else to come inside. My life of quiet order hadn't been peace. It had been a long, slow suffocation. Liam, with his calm presence and his own hidden vulnerabilities, had been the fresh air I didn't even know I was desperate to breathe. He hadn't just breached my walls. He had shown me the sky beyond them. And I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that I could never go back to living inside them again. We stood there for a long time, just breathing together, listening to the ocean, at the beginning of everything.